Okay, well, welcome back everyone to our Jepson mini workshop on biodiversity challenges, California floristics, taxonomy, and phylogenetics. And this is module 4, focusing on how nomenclatural rules impact taxonomy. So first thing I want to mention is the issue of types. So every species or infraspecific name, that is subspecies or varietal name, is tied to a type specimen that's deposited in a herbarium and designated by the original author of that species, subspecies, or variety as the type. And an important point is the type specimen is not necessarily typical for the taxon it represents. That is, it may not have the average morphology, but the name is tied to the types. The name tied to the type specimen must never be used for a taxon that excludes the type specimen from its circumscription or delimitation, basically meaning the membership of that group. And so any name that we use in taxonomy ultimately derives from or can be traced back to a type specimen in an herbarium, because even at higher levels, each genus must have a type species, and each family must have a type genus, which in turn has a type species. And so genera and families are ultimately then tied to a type specimen as well. So these specimens are really the arbiters, the final arbiters of the identity of, or the identity associated with a particular name. And someone asked about monkey flowers earlier, so I do want to talk a bit about the situation with regard to recent changes in monkey flower taxonomy. And this very much comes back to the nomenclature. So this is the actual original material examined by Carl Linnaeus himself that was used in the description, the original formal description of Mimulus ringens, which is the type species of the genus Mimulus, the monkey flower genus. And this was published in 1753, the starting point for modern taxonomy. We call it electotype because Linnaeus didn't actually refer to this particular specimen in a sufficiently clear way as the type specimen, but it can be definitely inferred to be the original material he examined. Okay, so Paul Beardsley and Dick Olmsted engaged in some studies of the family Phrymaceae that includes Mimulus, looking at relationships across the group, and with particular focus on monkey flowers. And what their phylogeny, which has been sort of summarized in this tree on the left here, revealed was that there's some serious taxonomic problems with the current, or there were, with the circumscription of the genus Mimulus. So down at the bottom here, we can see the type of Mimulus, Mimulus sensu stricto at the bottom of the screen, Mimulus ringens. This is a plant that is much more closely related to other species in Phrymaceae than it is to the rest of the Western North American species that have been traditionally called monkey flowers that are delimited by brackets here. So we can see Erythranthe, which is a name that was used at lower taxonomic rank for this clade than the genus rank, and Diplicus for this particular group. So you can even see that Erythranthe and Diplicus may not be each other's closest relatives. Diplicus evidently more closely related, at least, to other genera. So in order to, so we have a real problem that most of the taxa in Mimulus belong to these Western North American clades that do not include the type species Mimulus ringens. And at the bottom here are primarily Eastern North American species, which is more closely related to a bunch of genera that are not in our North American flora, mostly Australian things. So if one chose to recognize monophyletic genus containing all species currently treated in Mimulus, that taxon would contain all or nearly all species of the family Phrymaceae. But alternatively, we could recognize the long pedicelled monkey flowers that form a clade here as the genus Erythranthe, and the short pedicelled monkey flowers in Western North America as the genus Diplacus, which also are marked by difference in ovary placentation, with Erythranthe having axile placentation at the ovaries and Diplacus having parietal placentation. And that's the solution that has been employed in the Jepson e-flora. An alternative possibility to all of this, and one we haven't really talked about, is one could propose conserving usage of the genus name Mimulus for Western North American monkey flowers with a new type. And the plant that people that work experimentally on Mimulus would like to represent that type is Mimulus guttatus, the common monkey flower, which is has been used as a genetic model system in plant evolutionary studies. So this is more easily said than done, however. This is not something that one can just do on their own to say, okay, now the type of Mimulus is going to be a species up in this clade rather than down here. This requires a change to the International Code of Nomenclature for algae, fungi, and plants. So botanical nomenclature, the names that are associated with different plant groups, are governed by rules published in this code, which is revised every 6 years following the Botanical Congress. It's held in different international locations that jump around each year, or every 6 years. There'll be 7 actually for the next one in Madrid next year because of COVID. There was a delay, but usually 6 years. And this code then applies to all taxa at the rank of family and below. And it's a distinct code governing names than the codes that apply to zoological names and bacteriological names. Those are 2 separate codes for bacteriology and zoology. And it's important also to note that each taxon has only one correct name at a given rank, at a species rank, for example. There are a few exceptions. In the case of, for example, some plant families, like the sunflower family, we use the names Asteraceae with the conventional ending ACEAE, or we can use the family name Compositae, the original name of the family that's more descriptive. And so there are a few cases where more than one correct name can be used, but they're pretty unusual. And the names have to be Latin or in Latin in form. The rules are retroactive. And again, the names are based on types, as I mentioned earlier. And also we have to subscribe to the priority of publication of names. So the principle of priority is fundamental to understanding nomenclatural changes that end up happening for strictly nomenclatural reasons. So priority dictates that if more than one name has been applied to a particular taxon, the one published earliest, was validly published at least, must be used. And for valid publication, you have to designate a type, for example, and you also have to use names that are Latin in form. You have to have a description or diagnosis. And there are a few criteria, but they're actually in the place of publication has to be one where it's disseminated to some extent. So there are some rules there. But the oldest name that's validly published is the one that has to be used unless a different name ends up being conserved. I mean, if the name is conserved with a new type. And the starting date for botanical nomenclature is Linnaeus's Species Plantarum from 1753 that I just mentioned with regard to monkey flowers. And in some cases, later names can be conserved, as I just mentioned, against earlier ones. But this requires submitting a proposal to the journal Taxon, published by the International Association for Plant Taxonomy, which basically oversees the Botanical Congress that's held every 6 years. And then it's taken up by committees that make recommendations, and it's finally either denied or instituted into the code at the Botanical Congress. And so getting back to monkey flowers, there could be a situation where a proposal could be put in to conserve that name with a new type, but it hasn't happened. So the International Code of Nomenclature is important to point out. It just governs guidelines about how to convert, or sorry, it just basically has to do with the application of names, but it doesn't say anything about how to convert phylogenetic trees to a taxonomy. That is what the grouping criteria are that lead to the actual taxonomy. This is, names have been applied to taxa long before phylogenies were being estimated. All names have to abide by the rules, but there are no rules about the criteria for what actually represents a particular taxon with a particular circumscription, rank, and position within the overall hierarchy. But most current systematists recognize only groups that are hypothesized to be monophyletic. And so monophyly is the one criterion that most systematists subscribe to in coming up with proposing taxa. And as I mentioned, it really, the weight of evidence is incumbent upon the person who proposes a new taxon. If people don't feel there's enough evidence for it, it won't get picked up and used to the same extent as if it has more evidence behind it. So that's a judgment made by taxonomists, whereas the rules of nomenclature can be fairly rigid. There is, however, another code of nomenclature proposed now called the Philo Code, and it's only been instituted for a couple of years now. And it applies what's called phylogenetic nomenclature, and it's rank-free classification above the level of species. There are no genera, there are no families, there are no orders, classes, or phyla, or divisions. They're just names for clades. And so it's freeing in the sense of the constraints that rank imposes, since you can only have one name for a taxon at a given rank. It does allow for conversion of phylogenies to classifications more readily. The main criticism against it is that without the hierarchical system of genera, families, orders, etc., it can be hard to sort of find yourself within the tree of life in, for example, a collection, how to organize collections. One thing we do know about genera and families, for example, is that a particular taxon has only one name at each of those ranks. And so it does help with respect to cataloging that diversity. So there are pluses and minuses between the International Code of Nomenclature and the Philo Code. Some people are classifying groups in both, using both codes, having alternative treatments. And if the Philo Code is widely adopted, it'll probably be widely adopted following a period where people apply names in both systems. And the names are tied to phylogenetic monophyletic groups, not to types. So there are no types anymore in the Philo Code. The names are basically defined based on relationship, which is spelled out kind of like a triangulation approach in terms of how that taxon is related to other taxa. Okay, so if you're interested in reading more about the I hate to call it a controversy, the disagreement about how to deal with the problem with Mimulus and the monkey flowers, there's a point of view exchange in the journal Taxon from 2019 that provides a couple of perspectives. The original case for the continued use of the genus name Mimulus for all monkey flowers was basically arguing for the value of keeping the plants that people study intensively as monkey flowers in the genetic community with that name, from the standpoint of stability of nomenclature. And then the response, which includes our monkey flower author, Naomi Fraga, and I co-authored this as well, just offered a bit of perspective here, argues for the case for the continued use of the genus name Mimulus just for Mimulus ringens, rather than for all monkey flowers. And the alternatives were laid out there in terms of what it would mean to recognize Mimulus more broadly if we want to subscribe to a criterion of monophyly, namely either to expand Mimulus drastically to encompass a lot of diversity or to conserve the name with a new type. And that has still not been proposed by any of the adherents to keeping Mimulus for all monkey flowers, or for all the Western North American monkey flowers, but we'll see if that ultimately happens. You can see the wide diversity of members of Phrymaceae here. Here's one of our Western North American monkey flowers, Diplacus aurantiacus, one of the bush monkey flowers. And here are representatives of some of the genera within Phrymaceae. Here's one even with fleshy fruits. I mean, it's a vast diversity of ecologies and morphologies represented in this family. So the option of lumping everything into one genus or so doesn't seem like a very good solution. Seems like we either have to go with the way we're going now in the Jepson E-flora, or Mimulus needs to be conserved with a new type. And there's quite a similar situation that happened several years ago in the genus with the genus Aster in the sunflower family. The genus Aster, as traditionally recognized, included both Old World members like Aster alpinus and New World members that are quite diverse here as well. But Guy Neeson for many years realized that these things were not necessarily very closely related to each other, and he had recognized New World genera for plants that have been treated in Aster. And then molecular phylogenetic data showed in 1999 that almost all the genera within New World tribe Asterae, including such disparate things as Lysingea and the goldenrod Solidago, were represented one major New World radiation that included all of our New World asters. So our New World asters, most of which are in Symphyiotrichum, but there's a number of other genera too, are more closely related to these other members of the aster tribe in other genera than they are to the Old World asters. And this article was published in 2005 to try to get mastery of the new classification, which is quite different but necessary because the Old World, New World asters are actually really distantly related to one another, quite similar to the monkey flower situation. And Boraginaceae is a case of changing understandings of family boundaries based on improvements incrementally in understanding of relationships. We had a taxonomy in first edition of the Jepson manual and the 2012 edition. They were very different from each other. In the 2012 edition, the Hydrophalaceae, Lenoaceae were lumped within Boraginaceae based on evidence that Hydrophalaceae or members of Boraginaceae sensu stricto and Hydrophalaceae did not constitute monophyletic group, but it wasn't quite clear how to break up Boraginaceae in a way that was natural. But more recently, there's been a lot of data required on relationships among Boraginalians, and a new taxonomy has recently been instituted in the Jepson E-flora, resurrecting Hydrophalaceae with a different circumscription, removing Nama and Ariodictyon that are now in Nomenclature, which is more closely related actually to some things that had been placed previously in the Boraginaceae, like Heliotropium and Techelia in the Herediaceae now, than to Hydrophalaceae. So we have a more settled taxonomy now at family rank, but it's kind of expanded and contracted over time and before that was possible. So there are also changes that can happen without an understanding of without any change in understanding of evolutionary relationships. And these are unfortunate changes. The first one is that we can just finally discover that there's a scientific name at the same rank that applies to a recognized taxon, and the principle of nomenclatural priority takes over at this point, and the old name has to be replaced by, I should say, the name that's been used has to be replaced by the older name. And that's just the way that the principle of priority gets applied. Although sometimes people, again, can propose to conserve the traditionally used name, but it has to go through a major procedure, and it may or may not be accepted. Outside of nomenclatural issues, there can be a decision to recognize more or fewer already resolved clades as taxa. So I mentioned the case of Asparagaceae, which can be recognized as a monophyletic gigantic family that doesn't have a good morphological character to mark it, or it can be recognized as a number of monophyletic families that make it up. So there we have equally natural classifications, but they're quite different with regard to the family classification. And it's also important to point out there's usually fewer formal taxa named than there are clades resolved. A lot of clades don't have names that are resolved, so there's always the potential to carve more of them out as taxa, and people sometimes decide to do that. We can also have a change in rank without a change in taxonomic position or circumscription. For example, at the infraspecific level, below the level of species, in botanical classification, one can use subspecies or varieties or both. Varieties are subordinate to subspecies, so you could actually have an infraspecific classification that includes multiple varieties within an individual subspecies, but that's almost never done. Usually people choose to use either subspecies or varieties, but not both as the infraspecific rank of choice within a given species or even genus. And sometimes people will make arbitrary decisions to just, oh, I think I like the rank variety better than subspecies or vice versa, and I'm just going to change all these subspecies names to variety names without any change of information content to the taxonomy. And that's an unfortunate instability that doesn't, in my opinion, really do anyone any good, but it does happen sometimes. Not that we have to follow it. And then finally, why can't taxonomic names change? Names can't be changed because they're not accurately descriptive. So just because a name is inappropriate, it isn't really descriptive of the plant, doesn't mean that it can be changed. So the species epithet for thimbleberry is parviflorus. Rubus parviflorus is the species name. And parviflorus translates as small flowered, but thimbleberry has one of the largest flowers of any species of rubus. As it turns out, you might have heard that the correct name for thimbleberry is actually Rubus nutkanus. And that's not because parviflorus is poorly descriptive, it's because Rubus nutkanus was recently realized to be an older name that has priority over Rubus parviflorus. And the only reason we haven't instituted Rubus nutkanus into the Jepson e-flora is because there has been a proposal for conserving the name Rubus parviflorus published in Taxon, and we're just waiting until the Madrid Botanical Congress next year to see how it's ruled on. And if it's rejected, then we'll go ahead and substitute the older name Rubus nutkanus, but we want to just see how this settles out. Also, names can't be changed because they're offensive or honor villains. So it's unfortunate, but just because a name honors someone who is now regarded as somewhat of a villain or a real villain, there's nothing we can really do about it, at this point at least. So Fremonodendron, the flannelbush genus, and many species of California plants that have an epithet of Fremonii honor Captain John C. Fremont, who was the first Republican candidate for president and who collected extensively during Western expeditions that he led. And he sent his specimens off to back east where they were named by Gray or Torrey. And Fremont's role in massacring native Californians and other actions has caused him to justifiably be held in considerable disrepute. I mean, he was involved in some real atrocities and was really overseeing those. So this has resulted in a recent change, for example, the name of the California Native Plant Society Journal from Fremonia to Artemisia, which doesn't have such negative associations. Oops. But many plants bearing his name have priority and were validly published, so they have to be honored according to the International Code of Nomenclature, unless the rules change in a way that that provides a justification for such changes. Okay, so I'm done with this nomenclatural module, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions at this point.